Hello, and welcome to the Jared Hurst Podcast. This podcast is about understanding ourselves, others, and the tools you can use in order to transform your life. This week's episode is me, myself, and I. And we're going to be talking a little bit about our relationship with ourselves. Now, this episode is not about self love, though self love is incredibly important. It's something that I've talked about multiple times on the podcast. It is something that can help with our self love, but that's not the main focus of what we're going to be talking about today. Today, what we're talking about is, as I said, me, myself, and I, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this came to be. Last week, I was driving on my own. I was going through Sedona and Flagstaff and all through Arizona, and I got a message from a friend. Now, what had happened is this friend and me, we had planned to go on a trip together. We were going to go to a concert, we were going to go hiking together, and the two of us were just going to have a great time as friends. Well, it ended up happening to where they weren't able to come along. So then I started looking for somebody else to join me, and I had somebody commit to coming. And then that person canceled on me about 2 days before I was supposed to leave. So then I started looking for other people to join me, and I just kept having things fall through and not work out. In my experience, I've noticed that whenever I have a time and I keep trying and trying and trying, I'm trying to make something happen and it keeps falling apart, there's usually a reason for that. At least that's the mindset that I choose to take. When I have that mindset of this is happening for a reason and I'm going to find the blessing in this experience, then I find the blessing in that experience. Well, as I was driving through Arizona, I get a message from this friend. She asks me, she says, "Did you ever find somebody to come with you?" I thought for a second. I was about to say no, and I paused. I stopped myself and I said, "You know what? I am on this trip with me." So I sent a message back to her and I said, "You know what? I am with my friend Jared, me, myself, and I." That text was emotional for me. I started to tear up, and I realized that the reason that I was feeling emotional in that moment is I'd finally came to a point where I actually loved being with myself. Now, would I have preferred to be with somebody else? Of course. I did everything I could in order to try and have that trip be something I could share with another person. But there is a time in my life where I could not have done that trip alone and had an enjoyable time. I would have been sad the entire time, but I didn't. I focused on how I could find joy in that moment. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I've spoke before about attachment styles. Talking is hard. Now, there's a bunch of different attachment styles, but one of the attachment styles is anxious attachment, which is somebody that basically has a fear of abandonment. And that's something that I've struggled with a lot in my life. Well, about 3, 4, actually, we're going to say 5 years ago, I was reading a book about attachment style and anxious attachment in particular. And this book was talking about how you could help to heal and become more confident and less anxious, which sounded like a great idea to me because I was tired of feeling this emotional roller coaster that I would go through, especially around relationships. I would hop on a dating app, I would match with a bunch of people, I'd feel really good. The dates wouldn't work out, I'd feel really bad. I'd have people that I'd message and I'd feel really good. They wouldn't respond, I'd feel really bad. I would just go over this giant tidal wave of emotion as I was going throughout my life, and I hated the lows. The lows were so challenging. So I said to myself, how can I start to fix this? I read this book and it said, one of the things that you need to learn to do in order to help start healing yourself through your anxious attachment is to learn to be comfortable with yourself. And I remember reading that and thinking to myself, why? Why do I have to be comfortable with myself? Why can't I just always have wonderful, beautiful people around me that I can share life with? And what's important about this? What I didn't realize at the time is that when we have a fear of being alone, that fear can affect our lives and the lives of other people without us even realizing it. I'll give you two examples really quick about how having a fear of being alone can affect your life and other people, so that way you can see why it's important for us to be able to start healing this fear of being alone, if you happen to have that fear. Now, if you don't have that fear, I do have other things that I'm going to share. So I promise this will be relevant to you regardless of whether or not you can relate to this fear of being alone. Well, like I said, there's two things that come to mind right off the bat when it comes to being alone. When you have a fear of being alone, it can affect your thoughts, emotions, your actions without you even realizing it. You won't recognize how it is changing your life unless you start to become conscious about the fact that you have this fear and start looking to see how it's coming out in your actions, your thoughts, and your emotions. So, for instance, one of the things that you might have is if you have this fear of being alone, you may end up making really bad decisions with your life. You've probably seen this. If it's not with yourself, maybe you've seen it with somebody that you love, with a friend, something like that. Somebody gets out of a relationship. They either get divorced, they break up with somebody, whatever. And because they're scared of being alone, they immediately jump into something new. Now, sometimes it's just because that person is ready to find their person and they're on a quest to find somebody to connect with. But there's a lot of people that when you actually look at those actions, and if you were to really understand what's driving those actions, it's because they don't feel comfortable alone. They don't know how to explain it. They may not describe it as being afraid, but what it really comes down to is that on some level, they are scared of being alone. And so they end up connecting with the wrong person. They rush into a connection that they're not ready for, that they're not in a point in their life where they're really ready to be connected with a new individual. So that's one way in which having a fear of being alone can end up impacting major parts of your life. Have you seen somebody that jumped into a relationship and then down the road they got really hurt from that relationship? Yeah. And a lot of the times they got into that relationship out of fear, even if they didn't recognize it themselves that that's why they were doing that. Another thing that you can do is, let's say you're in a relationship already and you have this fear of being alone. Your partner needs alone time. Now, this is something I have thought about and talked about for a long time. And that is that we all need different types of quality time in our lives. We need time to ourselves. We need time with our partner. We need time with our friends, and we need time with our family. Each one of those categories of time is important because they provide different things to us. Have you ever seen a relationship like a couple and they only spend time together? They never have time with friends. They never have time on their own. Well, a lot of the time, the reason that happens is because one of those people has a fear of being alone. They're scared of losing that connection with their partner because they're worried that if they're not with that partner, that means they're going to lose their relationship altogether. They have to constantly be like cultivating and being with this person in order to feel safe. And so you can end up with inadvertently smothering your partner, making it to where your partner never has the time that they need in order to get their needs met in other areas of life. Well, why should they possibly want time away from me? Why should they not be able to get all their needs from me? That is not a reflection of you. Just because your partner needs time to themselves or needs time with a friend, that isn't because there's a deficiency in you. It just means that that person needs moments of other experience in order to give them the richness and fullness of life. And so that brings me to my second point. What are the benefits of having time alone? Why do we even care about that? So let's say we take all the fear out of it. You're somebody that feels very secure being alone. You maybe even prefer being alone. Maybe you're one of those people that's just like, people, stay away. I like my alone time. So why is that important for us to be alone as an individual instead of together with somebody else? Well, the reason for that is there's two things that we get from alone time. One is we have an opportunity to reflect and think. So I'm on this trip, I'm driving the entire time, I'm thinking to myself, there is a purpose for me being on my own. There's some reason the universe, God did not want me to take this trip with somebody else, because there's too many times where I thought I had everything figured out and then it still fell apart. I'm like, all right, there's some type of divine intervention here that's keeping me from having somebody come on this trip with me. And so I was looking for why I needed time alone. And there was a lot of things I experienced on this trip, both of those things that I was telling you that are benefits from being alone. One, I had a lot of time to reflect on my life. I thought about my future. I thought about regrets. And I came to a realization that on some level, I felt like I was running out of time. I looked at how old I am. I looked at how much I have left. And I thought a lot about what I wanted my life to look like over the remainder of my life. I don't know about you, but that's not something that I usually spend the time to do. I don't sit down and contemplate my life and contemplate where it's going and what I want it to look like. But when you have hours in the car just on your own and you start thinking about your life, you have that opportunity. That alone time gives us the ability to reflect. And so I realized on some level I had fears. I had fears about when my parents are gone and when they pass on. I had fears about not living up to my potential. I had fears about not finding the right partner for me in my life. And so I had a lot of time to reflect along those fears and understand, where they were coming from and how those fears were actually influencing me on my day-to-day life, influencing my actions, influencing my thoughts, influencing my emotions. There were lots of fear that I wasn't consciously aware of till I was there in the car reflecting on my life. And all of a sudden these things came to me and I realized what I was dealing with and I could see where it was impacting my life. The other thing, the second benefit to being able to have time alone is it allows us to process through emotions that we've been holding on to or that we may not even realize we're having. Over the last month or so, I've been having some really intense emotion. I've been feeling some grief at times. I couldn't figure out why that was. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you'll notice that I talked a little bit about emotional layers. And I talked about how as we have an emotion, it will come back at different times because we haven't dealt with everything. Well, that's one of those benefits of being alone. Is I had time to explore the emotion that I was feeling, figure out why I was feeling that emotion, and allow myself to process through that emotion. If I had been in the car with another individual, I don't feel like I would have had the opportunity to really sink in and discover why I was feeling the way that I was. I wouldn't have allowed myself to break down and cry. I wouldn't have allowed myself to yell. I wouldn't have allowed myself to go through visioning exercises that allowed me to process through and release emotions that I hadn't really dealt with. But because I was on my own, I felt safe enough to do that, and I had the time in order to do that. Now, if you're already in a relationship, you're in a long-term committed relationship, it may have been a really long time since you had hours to yourself. And this is where I believe that each couple needs to find a way of working through things to where each one of those time slots is cared for. That we have time on our own, that we have time together as a couple, that we have time together as a family, and that we have time with our friends. Because each of those provides something different. Now, what looks right for you is different for each group. Some people may need lots of alone time. I was talking with my mom and I was talking with my dad, and they've had some interesting dynamics where my dad doesn't always like my mom to be gone, etc. And I expressed to her, I said, the amount of time that, or no, it was opposite. I was talking to my dad about my mom being gone. And I said, the amount of time that you need to be alone is not necessarily the amount of time that she needs to be alone. So if you feel like an hour a week, a couple hours every month, whatever, is enough time on your own, that doesn't mean that is sufficient to meet your partner's needs. Your partner is a different individual, a different person with different fears and different things that excite them and different needs and everything else. And you need to be mindful of what is it that this individual needs from me. So if you're in that kind of long-term relationship, I would suggest that you find a time where one of you can go on a 3-day, 4-day, 5-day, maybe even a week-long solo trip. Husband stays at home, takes care of the kids, wife goes off and doesn't necessarily go off to some women's retreat with a whole bunch of friends. Now, there's times when you need friend time, and that's important. I know with my ex-wife, she once went on a trip with her friend, and I encouraged it because it was great for them to connect together and to rebuild that connection between the two of them. But this is about solo time. Just you. So I would say that in that scenario, the wife should go off and have time just to herself. Or the husband should go off and have time just to himself. Or if you're in some type of same-sex relationship or whatever it might be, whatever your scenario is, there needs to be time for that. Make time for that. Also, make time for just the two of you. Make time for your friends. All of those things are important. The last thing, the third thing that I wanted to talk about today was taking being alone too far. It is important for us, as I've mentioned, to have time alone so that we can explore thoughts, so that we can explore fears, so that we can reflect on our lives and understand ourselves. It is healthy for our self-love, self-image, and self-esteem for us to enjoy time with ourselves. I know on this trip, I had moments where I saw something, and I was like, I'd really like a picture of that. I said to myself, why not? Nobody's waiting on me. There's not somebody at my destination waiting for me to get there. There's nobody in the car that I'm inconveniencing. So I turned around, went back, and spent some time taking some photos of something that I thought was cool, or reflecting and seeing something that I thought was beautiful for a few minutes, and just basking in that. I did that 10, 20 times on my drive, and that was just on the first day of my drive. I did that multiple times throughout my trip. So I got to enjoy time with myself. But I digress. We can take things too far. Something that I've seen a lot in society is you hear this phrase, and I think it comes from something healthy and it gets warped by something not so healthy. You hear this phrase as, I don't need a man. I don't need a woman. I'm too comfortable on my own. I don't want somebody else in my life. Unless you're basically perfect, you can't be in my life because I've already got things exactly how I want them. I think that comes from a really healthy place, first off. This idea of being complete in ourselves, where we are able to have joy in ourselves. We're able to love and appreciate who we are as an individual, that we can enjoy time doing things on our own. That is very healthy. But when we take it to the extreme where we say, I don't need anybody else, or it's too hard to include other people in my lives, I think a lot of the times that can come from a wounded space. That can come from a space where what we're doing is, it's not that we don't want somebody else. It's that we're scared of having somebody else. We're scared of having somebody else come in and hurt us again. We're scared of somebody else coming in and having to compromise on the things that we love and appreciate. Instead of being willing to have a dialogue with this person and believing that we can collaborate where we both can win, we think that we have to give up the things that we value in order for us to bring somebody else into our space. And that's not true. We are meant for connection. We are built for connection. Love, experiences, life has a richness and a fullness that comes from sharing with others and experiencing with others. Don't allow your fears to dictate your ability to experience all that life has to offer. Loving being alone and enjoying time on your own is great, but not when we make it to where it's the only way of life. Think about that. Ask yourself and reflect. If you're one of these people that already feels that way, you already have tons of time alone. So I would challenge you to go into your mind and ask yourself, why don't I want somebody else in my life? Is it really because I don't want somebody else? Or is it because I have fears of what bringing somebody else into my life means? I think that's a really important thing, to ponder questions in our mind, to seek to understand ourselves on a deeper, more meaningful level. I really hope that you can take what we talked about today and bring these things into your life. That if you're not comfortable on your own, if you don't love time with yourself, that you can start to learn how to do that. And it's baby steps. It's taking yourself to a movie. It's taking yourself out to eat. It's going on a trip on your own. It took me a long time to figure out how to be comfortable with myself. I had to make the effort to go out and experience time with me. And I had to think about the way I was experiencing those moments. I had to find the joy in that moment and train myself to have fun just with me, because I've been wired that I can't have fun with just me. And I know you can too. I believe in you. I know you can do it. And until next time, remember that you are not alone.